Okay, so today we're going to talk about rational expressions and basically graph what the graph would look like, but we don't necessarily have to graph them. So you're going to have to know one vocabulary word. It's called an asymptote. An asymptote is basically a line that your graph gets very, very close to, but never touches. And we've talked about this before with logarithms. So let's say that this is your graph, and you have a line that your graph gets very close to, infinitely close to it, and never touches it. That's called an asymptote. So all the asymptotes that we're going to talk about in this section are going to be vertical asymptotes. And all vertical asymptotes have an equation that starts with x equals something. Okay? So to find your asymptote, you're going to set your denominator equal to 0 and then solve. All right, we're going to use the asymptotes to help us answer the next question of finding the domain. So if you think about it, domain and denominator, they both start with a d. That should help you remember it. You're going to use your asymptotes as any excluded values. So for example, if you had an asymptote at 5, then it would be all reals except for 5. If you had an asymptote at -6, it would be all reals except for -6. The last thing we're going to find today is zeros. Those are also known as X-intercepts. And X-intercepts are what make the numerator equal to 0. So we're going to set the numerator equal to 0 and then solve. And you're going to list those answers as an ordered pair. Okay, if you need to pause the video, then go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the first two problems. Okay, so problem number 1, it says identify vertical asymptotes and the domain. So we're actually going to start with the asymptote. The asymptote says set the denominator equal to 0. So we're going to look at what does the denominator say, x minus 5, set it equal to 0. Okay, and then you're going to solve for x. So you get x equals 5. That's your vertical asymptote. So we're actually going to find this first, then we're going to answer the next question. So to find the domain, you're going to use that asymptote answer as your excluded value. So we're going to say all real numbers, or all reals except that answer that we had right here. So hopefully you get this answer right, because then that'll affect the domain answer. All right, problem 2. We're going to look at our denominator. We're going to say x minus 2 equals 0. If I add 2 to both sides, I get x equals 2. So that tells me where my asymptote is. And then my answer for my domain is going to be all reals except 2. Okay, so hopefully this section is not too difficult. When you're ready, flip to the next page, and you should be able to do these two problems. Okay, so we're just looking at our denominator. X plus 3 is equal to 0. Solve. We get x equals -3. So that's my asymptote. And my answer for my domain is all reals except -3. Number 4, we've got x minus 5. So set that equal to 0, solve for x. You get x equals 5. That's your asymptote. And then you need to state that your domain is all reals except 5. All right, so we're going to continue doing the same thing, except now we're going to add in finding zeros, which is our x-intercepts. So let's just start with the denominator. X equals 0. That gives me my asymptote. My domain is all reals except the number we just found, which was 0. All right, but now to find the zeros, these are also known as our x-intercepts. I'm going to look at my numerator. I'm going to set that equal to 0. Now, sometimes I need to factor, and sometimes I do not. So in this case, I do need to factor. I want to know what multiplies to -15. That adds to +2. So it should be +5 and -3. So now this means I'm going to have two different answers. One of them is -5, one of them is 3. And we're going to say these as ordered pairs. So -5, 0, and 3, 0. Okay? So now I'm going to keep going. Now I've got problem number 6. So I'm going to start with what is my asymptote. I'm going to start with my denominator. X minus 6 equals 0. I know when I solve, I'm going to get x equals 6. So this is all reals except 6. And then I'm going to look at my numerator. X squared minus 4 equals 0. A lot of times these factor, so that's a difference of perfect squares. So this answer gives me 2, this answer gives me negative 2. So I have 2 comma 0 and negative 2 comma 0. All right, last two problems. Start with your asymptote. Look at your denominator, set that equal to 0. Now this time I do have a quadratic, so that one needs to factor. So I get x plus 4, x minus 3, and when I solve I get 3 and negative 4. So I have x equals negative 4 and x equals positive 3. So in this case, when I say all reals except 4, now I have two answers to exclude, negative 4 and positive 3, because those are my two asymptotes. For my zeros, I'm going to look at my numerator. X minus 2 equals 0. So solve, and you get x equals 2. So that gives me 2 comma 0. All right, last problem. So start with your asymptote. X squared minus 9 equals 0. Since it's a quadratic, an x squared, then that tells me I should try to factor it. So when I factor it, it's a difference of squares, and I get negative 3 and positive 3. So x equals negative 3, x equals positive 3. When I do my domain, it's all reals except the answers that I got over here. Negative 3 and 3. I'm going to circle that just because I had a lot of work there. All right, and then my last thing is look at my numerator. That tells me my zeros or my x-intercepts. When I solve, I get x equals negative 5. So just make sure you put this as an ordered pair, because that's the point where the graph crosses the x-axis. And we're all done.